Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? No one being deafened? Excellent. Well, first off, thank you very much for staying this late in the day to come and see me. My name's Sean Herworth. I'm here on behalf of Glendimplex Heating and Ventilation. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a future home standard, the consultation, and the impact that we think it's going to have on the specification of heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So who are we? Glendimplex Heating and Ventilation own a number of brands, primarily in the heating, space cooling, hot water and ventilation technologies. And my role within that business is to look at the markets and the industry and see where things are going and make sure that we are researching, developing, and manufacturing technologies which will help people gain compliance in the future. As part of that research, we've produced a report launched this week which talks about how technologies are going to change, primarily in new buildings in the UK. And from that report is a summary of a CPD, which I'm going to present to you today. We have only 30 minutes for an hour CPD, so I've taken a number of the slides out, you'll be glad to know, rather than just rattle through it twice pace. This CPD will cover the key drivers and the future outlook, what the future home standard actually is, and what the 2020 Part L and F review of the building regulations are on our way to it, and some of the other things that we can expect to contribute to that situation. Do make sure, if you're claiming CPD hours, page 25 in the event calendar, or pass me an email address, or if you've scanned your badge, do make sure, if you make it to the end, that you get a certificate for it. So, key drivers and future outlook. Amidst a lot of political unrest, one of the things that has been established last year was the net zero target. So in the summer, when it was announced that we would have net zero carbon emissions by 2050, a number of different regulations and movements were kicked off. The buildings mission said that we would halve the energy used in our buildings by 2030, and the future home standard was announced to begin the change that needs to happen to remove fossil fuels and start to decarbonize our buildings. One of the key steps on the way to this is introducing NZEBs, or near zero energy buildings, and this is required to be compliant with the European directive and has to happen by the end of this year, December 31st, and that's also a critical part in the introduction of the building regulations. So the Future Home Standard 2025, this has really been brought in to start the change that's needed in our residential buildings, new buildings, for moving towards the kind of things that are going to be needed if we're going to be zero carbon in our buildings by 2050. The Welsh Government tracks very similarly what's been put into the UK Future Home Standard, and the consultation for Scotland, which is Section 6, is being consulted on this summer. So devolved government, slight differences, and due to having 30 minutes and being in London, we're just going to cover England today. So in summary, the standard looks to reduce carbon emissions by up to 80% over the current building regulations, and that's a significant change. To do that, it starts to introduce the technologies that might be required to get us there. So heat pump technologies, heat networks, electrification. One of the ways that it starts to describe how we might move there in the building regulations is the concept of a notional building. But in my experience of talking to people about this, it actually confuses people more. There's a listed set of technologies which could be used to achieve the new regulations. They're not prescriptive, they don't have to feature there. As long as all of the minimum requirements are met and the targets are hit, any mix of technologies can be used. And today, once we've covered what the regulations are, is really about modeling how some of those technologies look within our buildings. So although other fuels such as hydrogen absolutely have a part to play in the future of our buildings, the government has largely supported electrification of heat. This is through heat pumps, heat networks, and direct acting heating. And the reason that electrification has really been supported is because of the change to our power grid. Most of the progress that has been made in the UK towards net zero has been through the power industry. And the bringing on of offshore wind farm production and the removal of coal and transition towards gas and other technologies has decarbonized electricity. So this horrible, dirty fuel that everybody has in their minds, the stigma remains from the current building regulations on the far left, has been decarbonized. And if you look at SAP 10, which is the supporting framework and model that will be used for the new building regulations, you can see that it's actually the lowest carbon fuel when compared to gas and oil. The primary energy factor is slightly higher. That's because primary energy is an analysis of all of the energy that it takes to get a unit into a building. And so generation losses and transmission losses of electricity start to remove from that. However, electricity is fully in the frame now, and you can see that government are driving towards this becoming one of the key fuels of the future. That leads into Part L and Part F, so conservation of fuel and power and ventilation. The building regulations are being changed this year to meet some of the criteria that are required as a step towards 2025 and beyond. So in England, the plan is to release 5 consultations, including the Future Home Standard. These will look at the new residential buildings, existing residential buildings, new commercial buildings, existing commercial buildings, and a separate consultation on overheating within buildings. The first of these, which is what this report's based on, which is the new dwellings, that has consultation closed on 7th of February, and the response to that is due in the summer, and it will be applied by the end of the year. So regulation not known for moving quickly, but this certainly seems to be happening at quite a pace. And the main reason for that, although we need to get towards our targets early, is to be compliant with the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. To meet the EPBD, we have to have NZEB buildings, so near zero energy buildings, and they must be measured in primary energy. Our current building regulation system uses carbon, and so that has to be changed to introduce primary energy as a factor. The proposed changes to Part L have 2 options. Option 1 is a 20% emission reduction over current building regulations, and option 2 is a 31% reduction over current building regulations. Notional buildings are listed below. However, introducing primary energy and tightening up on carbon emissions are not the only targets, and the minimum standards for insulation and also for installed services have been tightened, and there's also been the addition of an affordability rating. Now, in all of our modelling, we haven't been able to get a building to fail on affordability that didn't also fail on primary energy or carbon. So we can only assume that this is being introduced now for use later to start to address the differential in the cost of fuels. But the aim of this is to make sure that, despite being compliant, a building isn't too expensive for an owner to run. The proposed changes under Part F are to simplify the systems, so removal of passive stack ventilation. It can still be used, but it will not gather as many sat points and has been taken out of the guidance. And simplification of the guidance to show which system is best to be used at which point. Another process of simplification has been the number of bedrooms and changing the ventilation rate. So previously, building service designers had to make an estimation of the occupants in the room, and now all they need to do is work out how many bedrooms and have a rate to calculate. So the change in regulations are not just about meeting the new targets, they're trying to make it easier to design and build buildings. In my opinion, to try and close that performance gap. If the regulations are easier to understand, the guidance notes are clearer, then you're going to get closer to what you're trying to design when you actually construct that building. So the next part, few slides, focus on the impact. We have done a range of modelling, and the report that I mentioned earlier, the details of that are available here. But over 170,000 new homes built, 22% of those dwellings are apartments, and the vast majority of those are high-rise apartments in London. But still, 78% of all completed buildings are housing developments. So we'll take a look now at what a traditional and what new systems might look like within those buildings. So apologies for anybody sat further back or with eyesight like mine, but a couple of numbers here. Hopefully the colours will help you if you can't read the numbers. What this shows here is a standard model for a building with gas heating, mechanical extract ventilation, and a single zone control. And what we have is, for each building, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom, we have the current building regulations, option 1 of a 20% emission reduction, and option 2 of a 31% emission reduction. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the current standard building passes the current building regulations in every instance. However, the only other instance that that building is compliant is on a 2-bedroom property to the lowest of the 2 proposals. The first 3 columns are the carbon emissions, and the final 3 columns are the primary energy factors, just so if you're not close enough to see. So that's a standard house. At this point, have to just explain quickly a little bit around hybrid heating systems, because a number of our models are based on hybrid and combined heating systems. The changes to electric and the way the government want people to specify means that air source heat pumps are a pass straight through all of this. If you're supplying most of your services, certainly hot water and space heating, through air source heat pumps, you're very likely to gain compliance. What we've looked at is a mix of systems. So hot water applied to heat pumps. So the better insulated a building becomes, the higher the hot water requirement in terms of the total electricity load. So addressing that through renewable sources can typically give you a little bit more freedom when you come to looking at how you specify the heating and the space heating. So a hybrid system is not just a gas boiler and an air source heat pump. It can be a combination of any different types of system which can integrate between electric and gas. So taking the same house as before and modeling hot water, heat pump, direct acting panel heating, and mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, you can see that the carbon factor is a pass in every scenario. Because of the transmission and generation losses of electricity, the larger buildings and the more strict targets fail on primary energy. And the final column is PV to compliance. So the assumption here is that a small amount of PV could be applied to these buildings to bring them up to compliance. Now, if you were really designing this building, you would probably go back in and start to look at the envelope of the building to get those gains. However, it doesn't really make sense. It would confuse our modeling if we start to change the building. So all we're adjusting is the technologies applied. The second solution looks at a gas boiler for space heating with hot water heat pumps and MVHR. And again, apart from the strictest target in the largest building, carbon is compliant. When you move through to primary energy, because the heat pump is picking up most of that load, there are still some issues in compliance on the stricter regulations, and broadly similar amount of PV or building adjustments need to be made to that house. However, building regulations, as you're probably well aware, not the only thing that's going to drive technology within these properties. The Planning and Energy Act is another important thing to consider. One part of the consultation that went forward in February was a question as to whether local authorities should maintain the capability to decide on the carbon emissions, primary energy, as well as renewable generation that's allowed locally. So we're still waiting to see whether cities like Nottingham, who have decided to be net zero by 2028, are going to be able to apply these kind of factors. And even the London plan, in fact, could come under that. On-site renewable targets could definitely be introduced, and also infrastructure constraints. Is there a gas network? Do you have the load required for the electric to heat these properties? And the usual budget and space constraints also. So moving now on to apartments. This is a high-rise apartment with a traditional gas boiler plant, mechanical extract ventilation and single zone controls. It's just compliant to the current regulations, but not close when looking at either of the other two options. The London plan and what's happened in London has actually been a really good precursor for this, because we've been involved in a number of projects where, because of the carbon tax and potential for overheating, different tax and different technologies have had to be used. So if we model the same building with air source heat pump as the plant, then you can see that carbon and primary energy is compliant. However, it's possible to go even further than that. And again, when overheating or carbon taxes are a concern, a smaller air source heat pump in the plant room with a lower or ambient loop, and then a small in-apartment heat pump which can provide for your hot water, your heating, and even your cooling, has proved to be a better compliant solution in a number of scenarios. So looking at low-rise apartments, again, modeling the same building, the hybrid system performs well in every instance apart from the lowest of the ventilation factors in the current building regulations. So in terms of the new regs at either of those two options, that hybrid system would be compliant. And just worth noting again, an air source heat pump compliant across the board for this, because that's kind of what the government is driving at being installed. Local planning regulations and restrictions largely similar. However, space constraints, not just inside the apartments, but in and around the building, also potentially an issue. And connections to heat networks are a consideration, particularly in London and cities and areas where that might actually be mandated if they're available. So, in summary, significant changes to carbon and primary energy in their rate because of the changes in the power industry. That's going to change compliance, and the introduction of new targets is even going to further add factors into what the traditional specification looks like moving forward. These are going to be introduced soon. The end of the year is when we're going to start seeing these systems become more common, and I think it's probably a safe guess to think that that first step, in my opinion, they're going to go for option 2. They're going to want to get as close to 2050 and 2025 as possible. So many of these systems are already starting to be modeled and used out in the market now. I think that's everything covered. I'm wondering whether I took a few too many slides out of my 1 hour CPD, but I can't provide half certificates, so you'll all be glad to hear that that will still continue. I don't know if there are any questions from anybody on anything that's been covered. No? That's okay. I probably wouldn't ask a question either, don't worry. If you'd like more information on the report, obviously the data behind the buildings that have been modeled here is for the presentation, it is very thin. However, all of the assumptions on the buildings and the technologies can be found within that report. It's on our website. If you go to LinkedIn, then you'll find the information there. And if you'd like a card or some information afterwards, or have a question and are not brave enough to ask it in this forum, then I'll be staying around for a couple of minutes afterwards as well. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.